Number 13, how to read the church epistles. I want to begin by talking about letters. Letters in the first century. Letters were written on a substance called papyrus. The earliest copies of all of our letters from the New Testament are on this substance called papyrus. And that's made from a reed that grows along the Nile River and yet that the New Testament letters are different than most of the other letters that have survived from the ancient world. In fact, the best place this is getting a little off topic, but the best place to look for ancient papyrus documents and letters from the ancient world, not necessarily New Testament, but just in general, is a place called Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, because archaeologists found a dump, an ancient landfill with all of these papers. And so the archaeologists and the paleographers went crazy, and they're still categorizing them. They just found so many hundreds and thousands. Even though they found this, I think in the late 1800s, they're still working on it, digitizing it, making it available. So we actually have really good knowledge of what ancient letters were like. They were overwhelmingly brief and to the point, because papyrus is expensive. Ink is expensive. And more expensive than either of those is the cost of hiring a scribe to write the actual letter out. Because writing was a specialized skill. It wasn't common in the ancient world. Maybe 5 to 10% of the people would be able to read and write. But then a smaller percentage would have the skill required to neatly write. And we have lots of papyri from the ancient world that show not so neat writing as well, including some New Testament manuscripts that are difficult for us to read. Paul's epistles, however, are extremely long. They are oddballs from the ancient world. The ancient world does not have, it's almost as if with him and the other apostles who wrote these epistles that we have in our Bibles, it's almost like they invented a new genre. Because we have some kind of similar things, but again, most of these things are about the length of a Post-it note, not a New Testament epistle. One more complication. There's no postal system. So the government does have kind of like a horse system that they can use, but Christians were not allowed to use it. So if you wanted to write a letter, a long letter, you had to buy papyrus, you had to buy ink, you had to hire a scribe, then you had to get somebody to carry the letter to your destination. And then there's still one more step. They have to read it publicly. They have to orate the letter, because you can't just hand it to somebody and say, hey, here's a letter. And it's not like they can make copies right away either. Communities could pool resources to make copies. And that's how we ended up with so many copies of the Bible, but not individuals, unless that was a fabulously wealthy individual. Now, originally, I want to talk about this whole part of orating the letter, performing the letter. Originally, there were no chapters, there were no verses, there was no punctuation, and there was no space between the words. Just think about this in English for a moment. Let's say I give you a page of text, and it was just letter after letter after letter, a whole page. And now I'm asking you to read that before the congregation. You couldn't just do that. You'd first have to sit down and say, okay, where are the words? Kind of like a word search, like this word ends here and so forth. And then you have to figure out, well, where are the sentences to end? Where do I breathe? And then you have to figure out tone. There would be a lot of preparation. So I'll show you an example, and I want to demonstrate as well, just because I don't have enough stress in my life. So this is an ancient papyrus of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 15 and following. And I'm going to read it to you in Greek, and then I'm going to read it to you in English. And I want you to see what it's like, just to get a little bit of a sense of it. Okay? You ready? All right. And I have a little laser pointer. Can you see that? See me moving up there? Okay. So this is epi, oti, is, to, emon, onoma, e baptistite, e baptisa, de ke to. Got stuck there. Tone, Tone Stefana, ikon, lipon, uk, either, tina, alon. I'm just trying to figure out where the words stop. That's what I'm struggling with. E baptisa, that's an easy one. Rar, apestilin, me, o. And now here's something interesting. There's what looks to be an X and a P next to each other. You see where I am? And then there's a line above it. That's the word Christ. They abbreviate it, just the first two letters of his name, and then they put a line on top. Christos is how you say it in Greek. Then baptizen, alla, evangelizeste, nice big Greek word there. Uk and Sophia, you know Sophia is wisdom. Logu, ina, me, kenothi, o, and then here we have another abbreviated word you can tell by the line on top. This is the word cross. Stavros is how we say that. O stavros tu Christou, o logos rar tu stavru. All right, now I'll read it to you in English. May say, this is the word it means, may say, that into my name I baptized, or you were baptized, I baptized also the Stephana household. You guys know this passage? Some of you already know what I'm going to say next, but so he's saying you say I baptize these other people, but I just baptized Stephanus' household, and then he goes on. The rest, not I know. So not I know, then we have to skip over here. I baptized any others. You see how much I'm struggling? I don't have to keep doing this, but I just want you to see how much I'm struggling. Now listen, I did not come into this cold. I know what this says, okay? I practiced reading this document multiple times before I got up here. I've got years upon years upon years of Greek under my belt, okay? If you have this typed out for me, it's just like the newspaper, okay? This is not a hard section of Greek. If people who read Greek understand, okay? But it's so hard. Why? Because I'm dealing with these, this letter here in the top left is an E, it's an epsilon, but it looks like a theta to me. Right? It's handwriting. I'm stumbling on his handwriting. I'm stumbling on where the word separators are. And this is all part of the picture for these epistles, because I want you to think of these church epistles as not emails that are personally written to someone, but as publicly orated documents that required a professional, which I am obviously not, to be able to get the tone right and to be able to do it in front of a group, because nobody's reading. They're listening. And that's something to keep in mind while you're reading, that they would have been listening. Okay? And for that reason, it's a good idea for you to read out loud so you can hear what you're reading. Or, hey, we live in the 21st century. Have your phone read you the Bible. You could do it for free. Reading the epistles presents some unique challenges. Now, the Gospels were evangelistic. The Gospels were specifically written, we looked at the Gospels already, they're specifically written to persuade people to believe in Jesus. They're written with a broad audience in view. The epistles are not written with a broad audience in view. The epistles are written to a group of believers in a city. Now, I think there is some evidence that Paul had in mind that they would swap epistles with each other and that there would be some interchange. But the fact of the matter is There are some times when you're reading the church epistles where you're going to say to yourself, I feel like I'm only hearing one side of a phone call. I hear what he's saying to them, but I don't know what they did that is making him say this to them specifically. And that's part of what you have to figure out as you are reading along in the church epistles. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the New Testament has 27 books. I'm going to show you this over and over again. The New Testament has 27 books. It has 5 historical books. We've already talked about them. It has 1 book of prophecy at the end. We're going to talk about that later. And in the middle, 21 epistles. This is a big portion of the New Testament. Now, there are 9 church epistles, 4 pastoral epistles, and 8 general epistles. We're just looking at the church epistles right now. Okay, that's it. These first 9 church epistles. They are Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians. Okay? And these epistles are arranged in our Bibles in a particular order. Can you guess how they're arranged? It's not I'll give you a hint. It's not alphabetically. Yeah. They're arranged by length. Do you see the exception? There's one exception where the length is, and just look at the word in Greek, the Greek words. Just look at that column. Don't worry about the other columns. You see this one here? Should be Ephesians and Galatians. If the scribes who order, this is just like not inspired by God, the ordering is just like somebody was like, oh, okay, we'll do the long ones and then the shorter ones. And if you're a scribe, that makes perfect sense. Because you want to make sure you have enough material, enough papyrus to write things out. And so you can squeeze more shorter thing on the same document, on the same papyrus that you can longer ones. So it makes sense, just like from a practical point of view, to do longer to shorter. They didn't have the book for a little while. It would just be the epistles of Paul early on got collected together, and then you have the Gospels collected together. They didn't have the technology really to do a whole New Testament until a couple centuries after Christ. It took time. Although it is probable that we Christians invented the book. I feel like we should have some credit for that. Like before us, they were scrolls. We invented this idea of the codex where you take these leaves and you sew them together in a binding. That was, we can't be sure that it's a Christian invention, but we definitely dominated at it. And I don't think there's evidence of others before us. So anyhow, side point. Do you notice, let me show you a chronological arrangement. Here's a chronological arrangement of the church epistles. You notice it's different than the canonical arrangement. Canonical means the order in the Bible. The chronological arrangement has Galatians first, although some scholars debate that. They will put Galatians a little later, and I don't really have a horse in that race. So, but this is just the more common ordering of them, is that you have Galatians about the year 48, and then 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, Colossians, and Ephesians, ending about the year 62. So all of these epistles written between 48 and 62. Now, these letters were written to Christians living in cities. There's one exception to that, and that's the book of Galatians. Galatia is not the name of a city. It's the name of a region. It includes multiple cities. But all the rest of these are cities, as we'll see in just a moment. So it's helpful for you, if you're reading the church epistles, to get yourself a map so you know what you're reading. Where you're reading, I guess I should say. And so geography is actually really helpful. And there'll be some times in the epistles where Paul will talk about different places. And if you can spot them on a map, it will enhance your understanding as you go. Christianity began in a rural context. Jesus spoke mostly to farmers and fishermen. But then before long, it spread to an urban context. And by the time Paul's writing these epistles, these are all major cities. Okay, Galatia, once again, is a region that includes multiple cities, but all the other ones are cities that people would know. The more you can learn about these cities, the better you'll be able to understand the church epistles. And not in modern times necessarily, but like the way they were in the ancient times. Now, Christians have put together books that can give you background information, such as The World of the New Testament by Green and MacDonald, or the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Background Commentary. The first book here that I mentioned, The World of the New Testament, has little articles on different aspects of the ancient world that just give you background information. Education, architecture, economics, what was a household like? These kinds of articles and entries, okay? Whereas the ZIBBC, Zondervan Illustrated Bible Background Commentary, will give you, it's a commentary. So you'll be reading through some part of the Bible, and then you can refer, based on that verse, to the commentary and see if they have any insight into those verses. So that's a little bit different. I'll talk about these kind of things more later. Also, we have a staggering amount of literature that has survived from the ancient world. One collection of this literature is known as the Loeb Classical Library, a collection of over 500 volumes where you have the original language on one page and then English on the opposite page. There's also a French version called Source Chrétien, Christian Sources. And the Source Chrétien is a little more prestigious than the Loeb Classical Library, LCL, okay? But also more expensive. So my point is, when it comes to ancient sources, we have too much. Nobody can ever read it all. You know, like it's just like incredible how blessed we are to know how these ancient people thought. The green volumes are from Greek. The red volumes are from Latin. And so when I say to you Greco-Roman world, what I mean is the world at the time the Apostle Paul is writing these church epistles, these people mostly spoke Greek, but they're living under the Roman Empire, which is a Latin world, okay? So they're still kind of thinking in Greek, and a lot of these Greek ancient literature is relevant to them, and it's how they think. They all know Homer. They all know certain, classics, at least educated people do, like Plato, things like that. But then they're living under the Roman Empire, and the Romans have their own literature, and that has survived. And they have their plays and their poems and their novels and their histories. All of this is helpful to understand the church epistles. I'm not saying you have to learn all this on your own, but I'm just showing you where this stuff comes from. When you see in a study Bible, they're like, oh, such and such said, Euripides says, da da da. Well, this is how you get to Euripides if you want to read them for yourself. All right, then there's archaeological digs. This is the Library of Celsus, which is an ancient site. I think it was not quite there at the time of Paul the Apostle yet, but it's a site I've been to. It's in Ephesus. And that was a library in downtown Ephesus. Just the facade is standing. It's actually reconstructed using mostly original pieces. And you can see they had all these little statues at the bottom of it. And you can't really see this too clearly, but there was writing all over it, both in Latin and in Greek. And then to the right, there's this massive gate that was constructed by freed slaves of the emperor. So that tells you something about the ancient world and slavery, right? Slavery is not necessarily, what we have in mind. If these guys are bragging about how they were the emperor's slaves, there were obviously some forms of slavery that were a little bit better off, because when you got freed, you got hooked up financially. Not all forms of slavery were like that, obviously, but it's really helpful for you if you can actually go to these places. So I am going to recommend to you again that you go to these places. They still exist. you see this guy, you were in Spain, that's close enough. Like, it's just different. The sun is different there. The ground is different. There's, a lot of stone. And the dirt is a different color. I mean, you don't understand what I'm saying? Like, if you can get there, obviously not everybody can, but if you can get there to these places in the Bible lands, in Greece and Turkey or Israel. Right now, Israel's in a war. I would not recommend going to Israel, but like Greece and Turkey, then it calibrates your imagination. So while you're reading the Bible, you're imagining the way it actually is, rather than based on some Star Wars movie you saw that you're actually importing into Scripture, which has nothing to do with anything. Okay, so anyhow. Let's talk about occasion. Occasion is really big when it comes to reading the church epistles. The question is, considering the enormous amount of expense and time required to write a document the length of 1 Corinthians or Romans, Paul is not writing that to say hi. He's not writing it to say, thinking of you. I mean, this is deep, this is serious, this is big, this is expensive. What's going on here? Each letter of the 9 church epistles arose from a specific occasion or reason, if I can put it that way, a circumstance. And the question you should ask yourself is, what was going on among the Christians in that city that caused Paul to write this big, long, expensive letter that would take a long time to get to them and then be publicly performed? What is the occasion? What is the inspiration for why he's writing? So you can discern the background story, because it's not like he gives you this in verse 1. I mean, maybe once in a while you get some clues right there, but generally you just have to pick it up as you're reading through the church epistle. And also the history in the book of Acts can help you. So that's something to look for. Now I'm going to give you some examples so you know what I'm talking about. Oftentimes we have the answers if we just read the epistles, but not always. So I'll give you an example. Galatians. What was going on that caused Paul to write the letter to the Galatians? Judaizers had visited churches Paul founded, telling everyone they needed to follow the law of Moses. So Paul wrote Galatians because, and you can see when you read Galatians, his tone, he's amped up. This is Paul in Galatians. I mean, he's ready to punch, he's ready to fight. I mean, not physically, but his words are edgy. He's irritated. These people are doing this bad thing. They're bringing this false teaching to these churches, trying to put these people under the law. And that tone comes through in Galatians as you read what he's writing. 1 Corinthians, a lady named Chloe sent word of divisions in Corinth. Paul also received a letter asking specific questions. And he talks about this in the epistle. He's like, well, when people from Chloe came, they give me this, and some of you knuckleheads are saying you follow Apollos, and some of you are saying you follow me, and others of you say you follow Christ. It's like, what's all this division? Well, how does he know there's division? Chloe has sent and he talks about it later on in the epistle. So when you find these little clues, they tell you the backstory of why is he writing. And then when you read what he wrote in light of why he's writing it, it's just easier to understand because it's not some ethereal thing. It's like, okay, there was an incident, and he's responding to that. And then as far as his letter goes, the letter they sent him, as far as that letter goes, he will quote it in 1 Corinthians. And he said, you wrote to me, and then he'll quote it, and then he'll respond for a chapter. And be like, okay, that's what he's doing. Now I get what he's doing in 1 Corinthians 7. You wrote to me, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Now, if you're going to read that verse and put it on your refrigerator by itself, now you're going to be a monk, and you're going to be a nun, and you're going to say, I should never touch a man, never touch a woman. You didn't realize that he said, you wrote. That's what they wrote. He responds back, and he gives a full chapter detailing all the different kinds of, single people, married people, divorced people, and widowed people. He goes through all of it. It's a very long chapter. And he says, basically, you can serve God in any one of those situations. But if you're married, you better touch your woman. And she better touch her man. But that's only for the married people, obviously. Anyhow, I'm getting myself in trouble. All right, 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians, there were false teachers that had ensconced themselves in Corinth who criticized and undermined Paul. And so 2 Corinthians is super combative. And he's fighting for their loyalty. And these people are talking trash about Paul, and Paul's responding to it. And he's trying to establish credit in a church that he had already been to and had already had such an influence on. And then Philippians. Philippians is a thank you letter. Epaphroditus brought Paul financial assistance from Philippi. That's the occasion. So now Paul writes a letter to say thank you. That's not all he says in the letter. He also does some other stuff. Encouragement, teaching. But as you read on, you see there is basically a sense of gratitude. And, once you understand that about Philippians, that it is a thank you for receiving money from them. Once you get to the part where he talks about grace, the grace that you shared with me, like, you get what's going on. He's talking about, like, money. But he has a great way of talking about it. It's very gracious. It's very eloquent. It's not crass. Like, I think our culture is very crass when it comes to money. All right, so when you're first time through reading the Church Epistles, if you can do it, this is my number one recommendation for you. If you can possibly do it, read the whole epistle in one sitting. Now, I think for Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, that might be too much. But now they get shorter as you go, right? So who couldn't read Philemon in one sitting? It's less than a page in most Bibles, right? That's the last of the epistles of Paul. But Ephesians you can read in one sitting. Thessalonians, Galatians, So that would be my thing, because if you can read it in one sitting, and even if possible, speak it as you read it or listen as you read it in one sitting, that gives you the overall scope of the church epistle. A fun way to do that is if you try to perform it as if you're the orator speaking to this group of people that has never heard this before. So when you get to certain parts and Paul's sarcastic, which he is sometimes, you inject a sarcastic tone. If he asks a question, you inject an interrogative tone. You get into it a little bit, like perform it. Don't just be like, read it all monotone, right? That's just a thought. The goal the first time is to get the big picture. With letters to cities, once again, you want to do whatever you can to reconstruct in your mind what was going on that he's responding to. Then you understand his response a lot better. A lot of times it's very easy too. It's just as soon as it's just a matter of putting your brain into that gear, and then you're like, okay, I get it. What's going on in that church? Ask yourself that question. What's going on in that city? What's going on in the Roman Empire? Does he talk about Caesar? Does he talk about a famine? Try to find out what's going on. What are their concerns? The letter is going to tell you what Paul's saying to them, but can you figure out what their concerns are? Take 1 Corinthians 15. The whole chapter is about resurrection. He's trying to convince them to believe in the resurrection of the dead. So what's their concern? Well, they didn't believe in the resurrection. And then, you do a little bit of digging, a little bit of research, you find out because the resurrection idea was ridiculous in the ancient world. Everybody knew that you didn't want your body back once you escaped it. So now you start to ask certain questions about, okay, but Paul is saying this is a non-negotiable. If you don't believe in resurrection, then guess what? Jesus isn't raised from the dead. If Jesus isn't raised from the dead, you can start following his argument. If Jesus isn't raised from the dead, you're still in your sins. If that's true, then I'm a false preacher. And what are we doing here, people? You can really appreciate his rhetoric, his persuasive speech, if you can follow the flow of argument. It's especially important to think in paragraphs. If I could take the verses out of your church epistles, I would. And I would leave you the chapters, but I'll take the verses out. Because the verses, they kind of train your mind to think in sentences, and what your mind should think of is in sections, chunks. Some Bibles insert paragraph markers or whatever, because you read the whole thing, and then it's like, all right, now how do the parts relate to the whole? That's really the question. And look, I know it's a pain to do this, especially if it's early in the morning and you haven't had your coffee yet, okay? But what I'm saying to you is really going to help you to understand what you're reading so much better if, when you are going along, you think to yourself, rather, I like this one verse. I think I'll post this on Facebook. Look, I do that too, okay? I'm not gonna hate on you for that. We can encourage each other with just one verse. But what really matters, much more than the single verse, is understanding what is going on. How is that verse being used? And I want to give you an example of a difficult verse. 1 Corinthians 15:29 says, "Otherwise, what will those people do who receive baptism on behalf of the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, why are people baptized on their behalf?" There's a whole group called the Mormons that took this verse and said, well, I guess we're supposed to baptize on behalf of the dead, so I got a dead grandma, so why don't you dunk me, and then she'll get saved. And they have this whole elaborate theology and pursuit of genealogies and ancestry so they can get all of their ancestors as far back as they can, and this one person is getting baptized 50 times for all their dead relatives, right? All from this one verse. It's just incredible, right? No other Christians do that, just the Mormons. But, it's something, right? And look, I'll be honest with you. I have read the commentaries on this verse, multiple commentaries. Nobody knows what the heck it means. Nobody does. Like, we're all pretty sure the Mormons are wrong. But we don't know what was going on in Corinth. And here's what I'm saying to you. That's going to happen. You're going to occasionally come across a verse or a phrase while you're reading the church epistles that you just don't understand. And you know what? That's okay. Maybe you get understanding down the line. Maybe some scholar finds, some new insight that explains it to the rest of us, or maybe not. But what really matters here, for this verse, 1 Corinthians 15:29, what really matters is that we understand what Paul is doing. Why is he referencing their practice of getting baptized on behalf of the dead? Which probably, by the way, this is my number one theory on it, just in case you're curious. Let's imagine a scenario that a mother had been a Christian, had an adult son, and she died, and now he's grieving, and he starts meeting her Christian friends and says, I want to see my mom again. I want to be with her. And they say to her, well, she really wished that you would become a Christian too. And so he's doing it on her behalf, not in her place, but because she wanted him to do it. That's I think, a much more likely scenario than what the Mormons are doing. Regardless, that's not my point. My point is this. You don't need to know what this is to get the main point. What's the main point? The Corinthians are doing something. And Paul is using that as evidence for his argument about the resurrection. His argument about the resurrection goes like this. If there's no resurrection of the dead, then Christ is not raised from the dead, and our faith is empty. Otherwise, what were those people who do receive baptism on behalf of the dead? What about this? If the dead are not raised at all, why are the people baptized on their behalf? He just kind of picks up something they're doing and says, why are you doing that if this isn't true? That's all he's using it for. And then he moves on to the next thing. There's no explanation about what this means, and there's no other verse in the whole Bible that talks about it. So don't stress about it. Let me show you another one. Second example. 1 Corinthians 11:10. For this reason, a woman ought to have authority over her head because of the angels. Is that on your refrigerator? Does somebody have that as a bumper sticker? Is that a tattoo on your arm? No, nobody's got this verse singled out as the verse of the day, right? Because it's like, what in the world are we even talking about here? And as far as the authority on her head, that's talking about a head covering for praying and prophesying. You can read about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this juicy little bit right here. Because of the angels. What does that mean? Does that mean that if she doesn't wear a hat in church, the angels are going to get tempted sexually? I don't think so. I mean, maybe. Or does it mean that there have to be these authority symbols in our congregation because the angels have their own congregation and they have their authority structures, and ours is an imitation of a heavenly get-together? I don't know. Nobody knows. I was in school, and my Greek teacher pointed this out. He said that he and his wife, first of all, he said he has no idea what it means, and neither does anybody else. And then he said, but he listed out like 3 or 4 theories because he's a good scholar. And then he said he and his wife use this to great effect in parenting. Because sometimes a kid will ask their parent, why? 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 Why do I have to go to bed on time? Because you're going to go to school in the morning. Why? Well, because if you don't go to school in the morning, then, the child protective services are going to come and take you away. Why? I don't know. The United States set it up that way. Why? Because of the angels. And that's how they used it in their parenting. So at least there's that practical application. Feel free to steal that, especially if you've got kids in that category. But my point is, don't stress if there's something you don't understand. There's stuff that all of us don't understand, and that's okay. What really matters is getting the big picture, getting how this relates to what's around it, getting the big thought, okay? Let's talk about form. The form of ancient letters, this is according to Fee and Stewart, Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart in the book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. They say that the ancient letters have these 6 components to them. They start with the authors, and then they mention the recipients, and then there's a greeting, and then there's a prayer or thanksgiving, and then number 5 is content, and then number 6 is final greetings and farewell. So when you're reading Ephesians or Philippians or Colossians or whatever of the 9, they're generally going to follow this form. Not because this form is inspired by God, but because this is just how letters are written in their world. And so Paul's writing a letter. Now, Paul's letters, I do believe, are inspired by God, but they're following the standard form, just like you would follow standard form if you were writing a certain kind of letter in our world today. So what really matters here? Well, it's the content, right? 90%, the lion's share of the letter, whatever percentage, is going to be the content of the letter itself. But you always do have this stuff in the beginning of the letters, and you have this stuff at the end of the letters. And sometimes that stuff is really helpful for figuring things out as far as chronology, location, and other interesting stuff that matters for super Bible nerds. For you, probably doesn't matter, but if you want to be a super Bible nerd, then you're going to be loving those final greetings, right? I love the part at the end of Romans. You guys ever see this? You're at the end of Romans, and it's magnum opus. It's just like the cream of the cream, right? Just the best of Paul. He gets to the very end, and this dude named Tertius just pops out of nowhere. Did you see that? He says, "I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, salute you." He takes a little shout out, and then just goes right back. He was the scribe. He was the amanuensis. The guy who actually wrote the letter. Paul didn't write the letter. Paul spoke the letter, and this guy wrote it down. And so he gets a little shout out at the end of Romans. All right, as far as these epistles go, they're loaded with theology and practical application. A lot of times these two things are mixed together. Sometimes they're separated. Like in Ephesians, it's 3 chapters of theology, 3 chapters of practical application. It doesn't get better than that. But more often than not, he doesn't present his theology in a systematic way. He presents it in a way that makes sense to the people he's talking to and the situations he's addressing in their congregation. So it takes a little effort to get verses together to develop a doctrine or a practice. Romans and Ephesians come the closest, though, to being systematic. And we don't need to go into the reasons why. Application. For application, ask these questions. 1, what is Paul asking them to do? Look, if you can just start with this question, you will avoid 90% of the mistakes that we Christians make when it comes to application. Always we ask the question, what does this mean to me? Okay, don't do that. What did it mean to them? Start there. And then, number 2, are my particulars similar enough to say this instruction applies to me as well? How much of what he said is culturally conditioned? We live in a different kind of society than the Greco-Roman period. Very different in many ways. So there are some situations that are going to line up. You know, we're still humans. We still have marriage. We still have kids. We still have jobs. A lot of stuff is going to line up. Some stuff is not going to line up. So you have to ask, is it culturally conditioned? And number 4, can I derive a principle that applies in general today? Even if your situation doesn't line up exactly, you can derive a principle from his instructions to a particular situation that then would apply to you today. Let's review. Sending long letters in the Roman world was expensive and difficult due to the cost of materials, the skill required to write, and the need to have someone carry and read your letter aloud to the recipients. Paul sent the church epistles to Christian churches living in major Greco-Roman cities. We know much about the culture, politics, and geography of these cities due to surviving literature, archaeological discoveries, and the ability to travel to them. Deciphering the occasion for which Paul wrote is the single most beneficial piece of information to help you understand an epistle's overarching purpose. As you read through an epistle the first time, try to get the big picture. Then, as you read through it again, try to figure out how each section relates to the whole. I know that's a pain, but it's worth its weight in gold if you'll force yourself to do it. It's okay not to understand a particular verse. It's more important to understand the point Paul is making rather than the particulars. And last of all, when applying the epistles to your life, look for comparable circumstances and general principles. Next time we'll look at the pastoral epistles. We'll cover 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. We just went over 9, so 4 should be just easy breezy, no big deal, right? And we'll do that as we continue through our class. Read the Bible for yourself.